While President Donald Trump continues to lobby to get the Nobel Peace Prize and talk about all these wars that he has stopped, evidence includes these days that it looks like the U.S. military is actually potentially ramping up for war again. That goes against everything that the president says and is definitely not a good sign. And yet we have to admit that that's what the evidence is showing. To try to break this down and to tell you exactly what we're talking about, we have back with us again today Colonel Doug Macgregor, defense and foreign policy analyst, former advisor to the Secretary of Defense, highly decorated combat veteran, and big-time friend of the show. Doug, welcome back again. I'm glad to have you on this topic.
Sure. I think in view of the most recent development of the 21-point peace plan that Trump has trumpeted as a brilliant breakthrough for the Middle East and specifically Israel and Hamas, I think it's important to talk about this because I think that plan is already dead on arrival, and that sets the stage for what we think is about to happen.
Yeah, then that's absolutely critical. I agree. We actually did an analysis of it. I think it was yesterday or day before, where what was on the U.S. 21-point plan that was going in is very different from the one that Netanyahu said that he agreed to. And is your assessment that what Netanyahu agreed to and what is the delta between the two makes it nearly impossible to actually accomplish peace?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think what we're staring at now is preparation for the next phase. If you're an Israeli, that obviously means to complete the job in Gaza, which I guess means doubling the numbers of dead, which people are now saying number over 600,000, some estimated 70% of whom are children. So I suppose they'll now try to ramp up to over 1 million in the hope that they can completely empty Gaza. And of course, they're also moving into West Bank, albeit more stealthily and more slowly. So the question is, what else is going on? And I think we have to look at the movement of assets that belong to the U.S. military establishment in the direction of the Middle East. And I think we're looking at preparations for a new round in the Israeli-Iranian conflict.
Yeah, and Gary, if you could put that first full screen up there, this is the news out. I think it's just this morning, if I'm not mistaken. It's talking about a lot of these assets that are being deployed. U.S. deploys military assets to the Middle East, what we know, and they're talking about a lot of strata tankers. There are a lot of refueling assets. What does this tell you?
Well, in addition to that, I think they also talk about the movement of large numbers of quote-unquote gravity bombs. In other words, the bombs that fighter bombers and bombers drop from aircraft. Obviously, they're equipped with precision kits, no doubt. But I think this reflects something else that you and I have talked about previously. We have a very low inventory on many of the missiles that we would want to employ in a future conflict with Iran. Not just strike missiles, air to ground or ground to ground or sea to ground, but also lots of anti-missiles, missiles designed to shoot down incoming missiles. So I see a lot of gravity bombs moving in that direction, and I'm being told a lot of old Tomahawks. These are obviously subsonic in many cases. They're not hypersonic. They can be shot down. There seems to be a plan to use lots of old Tomahawks. So I don't think we'll see, let's say, the volume of SM-6 missiles that we would normally expect to see because the inventory is low. And we're not willing to spend some of our high-end missiles at this point. We don't know where we might need them otherwise.
Now, one of the things that President Trump recently said when he was talking about this peace plan, that he said, it's going to bring eternal peace to the Middle East. He then, at the same time, basically gave just a 4 or 5 days. He said just a few days of warning to Hamas that they have to accept, or there would be hell to pay again. And so this seems like this might be on a short leash. Do you see any indication that action could be coming sooner rather than later?
This is entirely in the hands of Netanyahu. I suspect that he'll wait a little bit longer, but I don't know what that means. Does that mean 3 days? Does it mean 3 weeks? I just don't know. None of us could possibly know that unless we're present in these meetings. But I suspect that he wants to get ready for what will be the next round with Iran. Now, the benefit of resuming the conflict with Iran is that Gaza tends to vanish from the radar. So if you really want to finish off Gaza with lots of gravity bombs, in other words, massive bombing campaign on the scale of the Second World War, like Dresden, a good way to do that is simultaneously open another front against Iran. And he's got lots of fronts, as we all know, where he talks about 7 wars. At this point, I think for Netanyahu, he has everything to lose by waiting too long, because public opinion in the United States has turned against him. And even though they've effectively purchased the Congress and the White House, at some point, these corrupt people that we've elected to office will look at the tide turning against Israel, and they may decide, well, I can't quite do exactly what you want this time. If you want me to vote this way, you're going to have to be more flexible. You're going to have to negotiate. You're going to have to do these things, or I will lose what support I have at home. In other words, public opinion does matter. It actually has an impact. So I think he knows that. And right now, it's astonishing to me, and I don't really look at it in depth because it's not an area of expertise for me. But it is astonishing to me to see the numbers of Americans. It doesn't matter whether they're Republicans or Democrats, but the numbers of Americans who apparently believe that the Israelis had a hand in assassinating Charlie Kirk. It's really kind of surprising. It seems to be almost universally acknowledged. I'm not sure that's true. I have no idea. But what's true, it doesn't always matter. It's what people think.
Yeah.
So I think if you're Netanyahu right now, and remember, they're paying as much, I think, as $7,000 a pop for going onto social media if you're a so-called influencer and pushing a pro-Israeli narrative. If they're that desperate at this point and they realize public opinion is turning against them, I think I'd want to get this war over with Iran, thinking, of course, that they can win. I'm not sure that's true. In fact, I question it. But,
right. Yeah. I'm actually going to get into that in a second. But one of the other things that I think you had noted is that prior to the June attack against Iran by the United States and Israel, is that there was a physical meeting between Netanyahu and Trump. And now Netanyahu was just here again. Do you see any correlations between that?
I think they're undeniable. I think that it was another let's check signals. Let's make sure all the assets are on hand. Everything's lined up. I think that must have happened. There's no doubt.
And then one other potentially related situation. We had all these generals from all over the country. We've talked about what that might have been with you on the show yesterday. But what is the possibility that there was a non-public reason why some of these generals may have come back to talk about operational issues?
Yeah, I'm sure there is. And again, I think that would be limited probably to unified commanders and service chiefs. They could have had a meeting, maybe not all of the service chiefs, but service chiefs, certainly from the Army and the Air Force. They would definitely have been in any discussion involving the unified commands. And you now have Southcom, Central Command, and I guess obviously European Command. All 3 of those unified commands are involved in one way or another with either ongoing conflicts or potential conflict. But again, what was actually discussed, who knows? But they undoubtedly held that meeting.
And I want to look real briefly at the other side of this equation, and that is the Iranian side. There has been an attempt to have some kind of a new negotiation ever since the last attack to once and for all get rid of the nuclear program, or at least allegedly that's where they were going to go to. Those negotiations kind of broken down, and here about a week or so ago, Iran ruled out direct negotiations with the United States and condemned the United States and Israeli attacks on top of that. Now then, I guess just overnight, Iran also now kind of ramped up the rhetoric and said, listen, if there is an attack here, if you can put that second one up there, thank you. It says the Zionists, a couple of days ago, Zionists are seeking to try their luck against Iran again. So they apparently have the same thought that you do. Major General Moshe Rezai told State TV, the moment Israel starts a war, we will also enter a war with the United States, he said. Negotiations must not be accepted in any form at any price or without conditions, he said. If we enter negotiations, military force must in no way be used against Iran. Otherwise, we will retaliate not only against Israel, but also against American targets in the region. Now, this was one of my concerns in the first war when we engaged. I was afraid that Iran would take the opportunity to strike back at a lot of vulnerable American targets in the region, which we can't stop with our especially our tactical air defense systems are useless against a lot of the stuff that the Iranians would bring to bear. But now then, even the vaunted Iron Dome, David Sling, and all the other integrated systems they had, THAAD, et cetera, a bunch of the Iranian stuff got through then, and by all accounts, those production have continued on since that time, and we would also be vulnerable to that. Are you concerned that this time Iran might not do what they did at the end of last time, which is throw a couple of token missiles into our base at Qatar, knowing they were going to get shot down, and then that's the end? Would they do it this time, or is this just more bluster?
No, I don't think it's bluster at all. I think there is no incentive for the Iranians to exercise much restraint. He's effectively said that. We have to consider a war with Israel now, a war with America. The question is, what does that mean in practice? I think there are a couple of things. First of all, we're not unaware of that, and we take that threat seriously. So the numbers of our forces in the region who are vulnerable to attack by Iran has been dramatically reduced. We've gotten a lot of those forces out. Secondly, the Iranians that have done a lot of work to repair their integrated air defenses have reportedly not yet reached what we would call 90 to 100% effectiveness. When you look at the S-400, S-300 systems and the numbers of missiles for them, they're probably at 60 to 70% readiness in terms of readiness for an all-out war. So there's a feeling in both the U.S. and Israeli circles that since their integrated air defenses are not yet up to the 90% level, this is a good time to attack. Frankly, I think that's on people's minds. The other thing is that I think there's a failure to come to terms with the reality that Iran is a much more cohesive society than we think it is. I still think there is the belief that if you can hit the right targets enough times with enough violence, that includes decapitating the regime by killing the president and others, that Iran itself will fall apart, that it can then be balkanized. I don't agree with that. And I think the Iranians are prepared for that. They've actually said so. If you try to kill the people in charge, you may succeed. If you do, there are more people ready to take over and continue the fight. And then secondly, all the talk about invading northern Iran with a force that would come from Azerbaijan that would try to incite rebellion amongst the Azeri Turks that live inside northern Iran who happen to be Shiite has kind of died out. You would think on that basis alone, they would have reconsidered many of their assumptions. But there's probably still some evidence somewhere, I haven't seen it, that the Mossad is active in Azerbaijan and will try to do whatever they can to disrupt and divide the people of Iran. It's just that I don't see much evidence that it has any chance of success.
Now, speaking of chance of success, what do you, obviously this is not anything that's out there publicly, but just as best you can piece together, what would be the military objective of striking Iran again? I mean, we've allegedly already obliterated all of the weapons, nuclear weapons facilities, allegedly. But if you say, well, they were damaged, what would be the objective in a second? What would be the attainable military objective if we went back and attacked Iran?
Well, you just asked a critical question. What's the political military objective that is actually attainable? This is where there's probably disagreement between us and others and the people that are in charge in the U.S. military and in the Israeli Defense Force. They may think that, as I said earlier, hitting enough of the right targets with enough violence, enough munitions, enough destructiveness can actually break up the Iranian state. And if the Iranian state can be broken up, in other words, real revolution can be incited, then there's a chance to divide Iran into multiple states. This, by the way, as we both know, is the underlying assumption that we could do this to Russia. We would use Ukrainian manpower, but provide them with enough military equipment to not just damage Russia, but to balkanize the place, break it up, and then we could go in and rape its resources. We're interested in controlling the oil and gas in the region. This is a long-term strategic objective. You can go all the way back to the 1990s. We can de facto control the oil and gas resources in the Arab countries. We can do it by buying off the elites, which we have successfully done for years, or we can actually move in with military power and seize them. You can't do that with Iran. You can't do that with Turkey, or Turkey, as they now want to be called. So the only hope of really gaining control of the oil and gas resources to the point where, it's monetarily profitable and the investment pays off, especially if you begin to look at our own weakening financial condition, is for Iran to be knocked out of the equation. It must be balkanized. It must be destroyed, divided, and balkanized. So this is the last shot, and this is what we're prepared to support. The interesting thing, of course, is this also happens against the backdrop of impending conflict or crisis with Venezuela.
And how do you see those things going together? In fact, speaking of Venezuela, that was also on President Trump's mind recently.
Yeah, I think the problem with our assumption, again, all operational planning depends upon assumptions. What are the assumptions that underpin the plan? Strategically, we have a bad habit of making assumptions that are fundamentally false. But by doing so, it allows us to execute the action. The capability to do something is frequently why you do it, not necessarily because you need to. You have the capability on hand. Well, why not? Let's try it and see if it works. A lot of that goes on. I mean, why did we go into Iraq? Why did we go in and stay in Afghanistan? Why did we go after Libya? Why have we gone into Syria? I mean, you start asking these questions. Is there a real need or national security justification for it? I think you can say probably not. But we had the capability to do it, so we did it. And I think with Venezuela, there's a similar set of assumptions that Venezuela internally is very weak, that the population does not support Maduro and his government, that the population could be persuaded either through violence and intimidation or through other kinds of incentives, including monetary ones, that would allow us to easily subvert the regime that is there, remove, either kill or replace Maduro. And then suddenly the skies would open, beautiful flowers would grow, and we would be able to go in and exploit the oil and gas and gold and emeralds and everything else without much interference. I mean, literally, it's a sort of rosy scenario problem. I don't think that's the case. I think, in fact, the Venezuelans, whatever you think of them, are very proud of their history of rebelling against Spanish rule, throwing the Spaniards out, and fiercely defending their independence, regardless of whether or not they necessarily liked the governments that were in charge. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that we got to go back and look at history. Cuba, Mexico, and Venezuela were always sympathetic to the communists. They supported the communists during the Spanish Civil War. Why would they do that? Well, guess who didn't? The Chileans and the Argentinians didn't support the communists. They supported what we call the fascists, Franco. So the point is, there's a long history here. And to assume away a lot of the realities is dangerous. But I think that's what we do. We did that everywhere. Before we went into Iraq, you'll remember this. There were so many people that said, whatever you do, don't occupy the place. Get in, get out. Accomplish your mission. Everybody wanted to know what's that. Well, obviously, remove Saddam. Well, that took a lot longer than it was supposed to take. But once you'd done that, it would have been very wise to leave. But we didn't do that. We stayed longer. Huge mistake. We ended up putting the Iranians in charge. I mean, Iran really owes us an enormous debt of gratitude. We made it very easy for them to transform Iraq into an ally instead of an adversary. But we don't listen to these things. And so I don't see us listening to reason on Venezuela. I mean, you can forget all the drug cartel nonsense because Venezuela's role in that is minuscule. The drug hub is still Colombia. And most of that comes out of the west coast of Colombia or is flown in. We haven't even talked about what comes through the Canadian border into the United States. That's another nightmare. The point is, it's really about oil and gas and gold and emeralds. That's what they have. The problem is you've got 1,700 miles of coastline. Think about that. That's almost the same length as America's border with Mexico.
Wow.
Then on top of that, you have 1,370 plus miles of border with Brazil, 1,370 plus miles of border with Colombia. And there's a danger that going into Venezuela could awaken a lot of people from a long sleep. And what do I mean by that? You could end up with the fight in Venezuela becomes every Latin American's fight against the Yankees everywhere. And so paramilitaries from Brazil, paramilitaries from Colombia, who knows, pour into Venezuela. Guyana next door is destabilized and sinks into criminality. I mean, there are all sorts of bad things that can result from this. So I see no evidence for any clear-cut outcome other than something bad. That's the problem. I think when you look at Iran, that's a little different. But again, it's another rosy scenario, And then the problem comes about what happens if it doesn't work. And my experience is that people don't really have a good fallback position. What do you do? Do you put you do one of two things with Venezuela. If it doesn't work and you look stupid, you can go home and sort of call it a day and say, I made a mistake. We shouldn't have done this. I don't see much evidence that we're prepared to do that.
No, I don't either.
I think you would probably have someone that says, well, what's the Marine Corps doing this week? Let's send it, because that's what you would need. And you're only talking about Caracas. I mean, you could seize Caracas with a Marine Expeditionary Force, most of it, but it's huge. And now you want to hold on to it? And what kind of guerrilla warfare are you prepared to fight through the barrios? What about the rest of the place? What if they decide to blow up the oil wells? What do you do at that point?
We've seen that happen before.
Yeah, of course. So I just don't think we've thought that through. And the problem with Iran is similar. What happens if none of what you thought would happen happens? And that's where you begin to worry about what the Israelis are going to do, because Israel could be on the receiving end of a very serious bombardment. Right. The Iranians inflicted, I think, $50 billion worth of damage the last time around. How much more could they inflict this time? And if they don't restrain themselves at all, what would that mean for the civil population, what there is left of it in Israel? Because we know that a lot of people have left and gone to Cyprus or other countries to get away from Israel. We know that on the ground, lots of Israeli reservists don't want to show up for the fight. I don't know how long the Israelis can keep going under those circumstances. Would they then turn to the use of a nuclear weapon? To me, that would be catastrophic for everyone, including them. But no good news here, Dan.
There's not. And before I leave this topic, we talked about timing potentially. Do you see, are you concerned at all the fact that the anniversary, the 2-year anniversary of October the 7th is now just less than a week away, that might be a trigger?
Sure. Absolutely. Why not? I mean, the Soviets launched their big offensive that took them into Germany for the first time, into parts of Germany, on the 23rd or 22nd of June, which was, this is 1944, which was timed to be exactly 3 years after the German invasion of the Soviet Union. That was Operation Bagration. So that's something the Soviets did. It seems reasonable that the Israelis might do something similar.
Well, we don't have long to find out. I hope it doesn't happen. I hope that day passes with no new wars, but we'll have to leave that where it's at. One of the things you mentioned here was about the U.S., whether it's Iran or potential conflict in Venezuela, is what is the strategy? And strategy was kind of on display at the meeting that Secretary of War Hegseth and President Trump addressed yesterday, publicly anyway, with all those generals. And one of the things that Hegseth said is that he was looking for ways to reduce some of the overhead in some of the generals. Now, before I talk about or show some of the things that he specifically said, I want to show this first because it's going to play a role in this, and that is a paper that you authored that I know through probably several different avenues you got into senior administration officials prior to, or at least right around the time of the inauguration, as a means of here is a good strategy. And in the paper, this is the abstract, says the United States is navigating a fiscal storm that demands a significant course correction in its defense strategy, leadership, and mindset. The current defense policy, anchored in obsolete structures and strategies, is akin to a ship too costly to maintain and ill-equipped to sail the complex waters of this century. This paper advocates for a daring new approach to national defense, seizing the fiscal crisis as a catalyst to trim the fat, streamline investments, and reset our force structure by adopting a new grand strategy that prioritizes diplomacy and peaceful cooperation. I love that line. The U.S. can gain a competitive edge in future warfare and strengthen national security. Love every one of those things. Now, I know for sure that because I know at some of the highest levels of cabinet level, I know for in one case that was given to some members of the president's administration, but hadn't seen hardly anything happen about that since then. But now here's a comment yesterday that Secretary Hicks has said that when I read your paper, I'm thinking this sounds familiar.
I have fired a number of senior officers since taking over. The previous chairman, other members of the Joint Chiefs, combatant commanders, and other commanders. The rationale for me has been straightforward. It's nearly impossible to change a culture with the same people who helped create or even benefited from that culture, even if that culture was created by a previous president and previous secretary. But in many ways, it's not their fault. It's not your fault. As foolish and reckless as the woke department was, those officers were following elected political leadership.
That's probably
an entire generation.
The part that really got my attention was that he was saying the culture that helped make the system is not going to be able to reform the system, which was one of the headlines or one of the important parts that you wrote in that. So it sounds like that they received part of that, but then the way they're executing it is not quite so far. What can you tell us about the paper? And we're going to get into the details of the paper itself, but what can you tell us about how it was received at the administration, as far as you know?
Well, the paper that you've got and that I hope people will read was delivered by me at the request of RFK Jr. People are not aware of it, but I actually supported RFK Jr. for the presidency. And then he made the decision to join the Trump team. And we had several discussions, and he said, why don't you write a paper on what you think ought to happen and send it to me? And that's what I did. And that's the paper that you've got. And he looked it over and he said, that's great. And he gave it to President Trump. Don Jr. allegedly received a copy. So did Tulsi Gabbard. I'm told that eventually copies found their way into numerous people's hands. And I'm quite confident, even though Hegseth at that point had not yet been identified, at least not publicly, I'm sure that his team, because I know one or two people working for him right now, actually had a copy of the paper, and they probably pulled things out of it. In fact, I know they did, and that's fine. I'm glad they did, even if they got it wrong, and they did get some things wrong. He talks later on about 4 stars and 5 stars. He doesn't understand that until the war was almost over, we only had 7 4 stars for 12 million soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. That's quite a ratio. I mean, if you look at 43 right now or 42 for 1.18 million versus 7 for 12 million, that suggests that we ran things a lot differently. And in fact, Marshall was approached all the time, over and over and over. You need to promote so-and-so to 4 stars. I would like you to do this. He said, no, Senator, I can't do that. And finally, several senators said, why not? He said, because I don't have time to argue. I have to win the war. And remember, he already had 3 other 4 stars in Army uniform that he had to argue with. One was MacArthur, one was Arnold, and one was Eisenhower. And of those 3, the only guy he really had to argue with from time to time was MacArthur. And contrary to popular belief, Marshall and MacArthur had a great deal of respect for each other, and he listened to MacArthur because he respected his experience and his strategic thinking. You only had three in the Navy. Leahy, who had been chief of naval operations, he worked for FDR as effectively his senior military advisor, and we would today call that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And then you had King and you had Nimitz. That was it. Those are the only 4-stars. And it stayed that way until the war almost ended. And then they started promoting people within the last 6 months of the war as thank you for coming promotions. We call them honorifics. You did a great job. You get a 4-star. And the other thing very few people understand is that until after World War II, when you retired in the United States Army, I think it was true in the Navy as well, if you had 3 or 4 stars, it didn't matter. You reverted to 2 stars. There were no permanent ranks over 2 stars. Everyone went back to being a major general. The first exception to that was Pershing after World War I. They called him General of the Armies, remember? And he got to be a 4-star. The point is that we've been through at least 80 years of rank inflation and bureaucratic bloat beyond anybody's imagination because we built a force for global military hegemony. And that was done under the guise of containing communism. Well, that's over. And the worst part is we can't afford it. We're just broke. And so my assumption, and I think RFK Jr. believed this strongly, we have to deal with the fiscal crisis. We have to cut spending. Well, boy, we were wrong. We're not cutting anything. The Democrats have a $3 trillion deficit for their budget. The Republicans have a $2 trillion deficit for their budget. Who are we kidding? We're spending worse than we ever have.
And as it turns out, though, I think that Secretary Hegseth did read your paper because he actually said something. It's been almost 4 months ago that he said this, but he laid out a marker of what they are going to try to do to reduce, and that is cull the general officer corps.
In history, when we were fighting across the globe during World War II, we had a force that was 12 million strong. For that 12 million man element, we had 17 4- and 5-star generals. Today, we have 2.1 million service members with 44 4-star and flag officers. So it used to be a ratio of 1 general to 6,000 troops. Today, it's 1 general to 1,400.
So, yeah, that's nearly straight out of your paper.
Yeah, except that he got it wrong on the 17. That's all. The other 10 are promotions that come towards the end of the war. The operational conduct of the war, the strategic planning and direction, was done by 7 men. That's what needs to be understood. So in the paper, when I restructured the unified commands, the functional commands, the services, everything, I was able to get the numbers of 4-stars from roughly 43 or 44, whatever it is right now, down to 10. Now, somebody said, well, what difference does that make? Change, fundamental change, structurally, culturally, happens from the top down in the military. It doesn't start at the bottom and work its way up. If you do not fundamentally adopt a new strategy and then adapt that structure to the new strategy, nothing changes, which is why simply eliminating 20% of the 4-stars sounds like a great idea. It's not going to fundamentally change anything. In fact, based on the last 80 years of experience, if you try to eliminate a certain number of generals without changing the structure, eventually they come back. It's sort of like a Stephen King movie. If you don't drive a stake through the heart of the structure, they come back. And so just getting rid of 20% of the generals, 4 or 5 years from now, they could all be reconstituted. So what you've got to do is change the structure. But without a new strategy, you don't get a change in the structure. And I remember the Army Chief of Staff, in fact, my classmate at West Point, Ray Odierno, said something I thought was very intelligent and very important. He said, you keep asking us to do more with less. How about asking us to do less with less? And he was right. Everything is overstretched. And now you have the potential for 3 giant military confrontations. One in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine or central Ukraine, whatever it turns out to be. One in the Middle East. It could involve everybody at some point. And now Venezuela, which I think could become the cause célèbre for the Latin American world against us. So it's sheer lunacy. We're not only not shedding unnecessary inventories of old equipment, we're not changing the structure changing the way we fight. We're not coming to terms with any of those things. We're just spending more money.
And I want to get into some of the specific parts of your paper, because I think it's really important for people to understand what a strategy, a combined strategy with the equipment, with manpower, what that actually looks like and how it's attainable. But I want to go, first of all, one more time back to Secretary Hegseth, because whereas he does say, I want to get rid of this percentage-wise of the General Officer Corps, he's going to then now here explain how he's going to do it. But to my ear, I don't hear the strategy part governing the change of the structure. Watch this.
Now, this is not a slash and burn exercise meant to punish high-ranking officers. Nothing could be further from the truth. This has been a deliberative process, working with the Joint Chiefs of Staff with one goal: maximizing strategic readiness and operational effectiveness by making prudent reductions in the general and flag officer ranks. So there's two phases here. Phase one, we're looking at our current service structure. And in phase two, it's a strategic review of the Unified Command Plan. Now, this is going to be, we think, the most comprehensive review since the Goldwater-Nichols Defense Reorganization Act of 1986. It's going to be done carefully, but it's going to be done expeditiously. We confront a complex and evolving threat environment. We cannot afford to wait. We got to be lean and mean. And in this case, it means general officer reductions.
Is he focused on the right thing there by just want general officer reductions and a Barry Goldwater type renovation? I just don't understand. I'm not clear, because he hasn't conveyed it, what that means. Now, you wrote in here that the first step is to come up with a new grand strategy. I wonder if you can explain that.
Well, you'll note that in the grand strategy, I also talk about how warfare has changed, how technology has changed, and why large numbers of forces forward deployed in various countries around the world and forward deployed naval forces are now sitting ducks. In other words, they've just added to a target array that in the event of a major war with any capable adversary, you risk losing everything that is forward deployed very quickly. That you live in an environment where you're not going to move hundreds of thousands, let alone 1 million men across the Atlantic or the Pacific to land in somebody else's country. Those days are over. So you have to determine that your number one priority is going to have to be defense of the Western Hemisphere, the United States, and its vital strategic interests. That means you're going to scale back these 800 bases overseas. You're going to have to look at those and determine what you need and what you don't. And you're also going to have to do something that we seem to really dislike, and that is develop a diplomatic approach to your friends and potential opponents. In other words, if you look at Venezuela, the only thing we've done to Venezuela is sanction the living daylights out of it to try and destroy its economy. What would happen if you went in and offered to relieve those sanctions and actually offered assistance and made it clear that what you don't want is a direct military confrontation? What kind of response would you get? Could you avoid the military confrontation that now seems inevitable? Well, the usual suspects in Washington, the neocons, have been riding the tidal wave now for years. Say, absolutely not. You can't compromise anything with them. Every event is another fight with Hitler, and anyone who suggests otherwise is a Neville Chamberlain, sort of selling out his country and pacifying the evil ones. You got to get rid of all that nonsense. You've got to change the way you look at the rest of the world and acknowledge that there are lots of middleweight powers right now that may not be as great and powerful as we are, but they have the capacity to do enormous damage to us. And it's damage we don't need to sustain. So the world itself fundamentally has changed.
So if we need a new strategy, it's especially if it sharply scales back U.S. abroad, what should the new strategy be? And if you scale back, where do you scale up?
Well, I think if you look at the 5 points for the foundation of a new national military strategy, I say, first of all, defend America first. It's Western Hemisphere, secure the U.S. borders, coastal waters and airspace. Military power may be used to defend American citizens and identified interests at home and abroad. However, and this is very important, unless the United States' vital strategic interests or its territory are directly attacked, Washington will and should avoid the use of force. Second, you maintain enough strategic power to ensure freedom of action in areas of importance by preserving our core capabilities. That means you identify, defend, and maintain critical lines of communication at a reduced number of overseas bases needed for the execution of these tasks. You declare, and this is extremely important and needs to happen as soon as possible, you declare a no first use doctrine for nuclear weapons. Now, that means you maintain the scientific industrial power to wage high-end conventional warfare. That's what you've seen in eastern Ukraine. That's what the Russians have done. You build nuclear weapons, but you recognize that the alleged advantage of striking first is illusory. You strike first, they return instantly with everything they have. Then establish an operational national defense staff. We have no real general staff system. We don't identify people on the basis of demonstrated character, competence, and intelligence for advancement to high rank to do the complex planning and staff work that's required. We need a merit-based system. That means people need to be subjected to examinations. They need to prove themselves, their intelligence and ability. And then that chief of defense replaces this thing called the chairman. He's no longer just the senior military advisor to the president. The chief of defense has real authority. And that's very important because right now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs commands nothing. Then you need to build new armed forces for the 21st century. That's going to take time. Just overhauling the anachronistic World War II structure is not the answer. If you're going to build a new car, you don't bring out the Ford Fairlane 500, give it a new paint job, replace engine parts, put it out there and say, this is the new force. No, you get rid of the Ford Fairlane. You build a new car. What that looks like, if it's a Ferrari or a Porsche, I have no idea. But my point is, you have to go through experimentation. And from your own experience on the, was it Force 21 or
Future Combat Systems?
That's right. There have been so many of these phony.
Right. I can attest to that.
Yeah, you've got to have an environment in which you have people that are isolated from the rest of the force. They're independently commanded, and they are given technologies that become capabilities, and you employ them, and you learn what they can and cannot do. And you prevent people from stopping change by doing that. You come out with real answers, but that means real experimentation, and that takes time. So all of those things are very important. They all have to happen in the national military strategy. I hope that we get there. It's going to be tough because you're trying to fight potentially 3 wars at once. Washington hasn't done very well at fighting just one war at once.
Now, you mentioned that you would have to change the force design, that it could take a decade or so from some of your books, especially.
Yes.
What would the force designs to implement this strategy you just laid out? What would that look like?
Well, I sent you the paper, and we probably should look at those two illustrations. Can we do that?
Yeah, bring chart 1 up.
This is very important because we tend to look at everything in the military from the vantage point of services. Everything is service centric. If you sit down with the chief of service, everything he says is designed to enhance, preserve, stabilize, and improve, the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, the Marines. But warfare has changed dramatically. And we need to get more return on our investment. We spend more and more and more money with each passing year, month, decade. And what do we come out with? We come out with some version of the same old thing, and it's not performing to expectation. And war is more than hitting a button and firing a missile. So if you look at the right-hand illustration, it divides everything up into 4 components: intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance; strike, which means anything beyond line of sight; maneuver, that means ground forces maneuvering; and sustainment, which is logistics. We need to change our investment scheme. We need to put most of our investments at this point into intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets from seabed to space. And we need to put more money into strike and integrated air defenses. We have no integrated air defense at all for the North America. None. I mean, we've depended exclusively on the U.S. Air Force to scramble jets. fly out there and shoot something down. Those days are over. We're going to be attacked by missiles in the future. We're being attacked by them now. And all sorts of unmanned systems demands a different force design. And then your maneuver will look at this and say, well, that's not enough money for us. We need more maneuver. But we're not going to send 1 million men overseas to re-land at Normandy. It's not going to happen. So if we're not going to send hundreds of thousands overseas anymore, which I think new technology makes prohibitive, then you've got to structure that force to operate within this ISR strike umbrella. That means that they'll be protected by it as well as facilitated, enabled by it. So that streamlines your investments. That tells you where do you put your money for the foreseeable future. We haven't done that.
And how, Doug, how have you seen that play out? Because I know a lot of those concepts you wrote going all the way back to the 1997 book, Breaking the Phalanx, and then several others that you published over the years. But now then we have some tangible physical evidence of a peer-on-peer war with the Russian and Ukrainian armies. How have you seen those things actually play out, and has it modified your original thoughts any?
Well, I think what you've seen now in eastern Ukraine is a validation of the ISR strike complex, which I outlined in the third book called Transformation Under Fire. And that is that you build a force design and command structures designed to maximize the striking power of your long, medium range strike assets. What this effectively means is that you build a system, so much as we've seen with the Russians, if you assemble a large number of troops in an assembly area, it's immediately identified, and you have the ability to mobilize strike assets at sea, in the air, on the ground, across a 1,000-mile front to attack that assembled force within minutes and annihilate it. So at this point, if you're a Ukrainian, you have no means of maneuver anymore because you are now under persistent surveillance, and the Russians have innumerable strike assets with which to destroy your force. That is the sort of realization of the revolution in military affairs that people talked about in the 70s. Well, it's happened. And the only thing that AI, artificial intelligence or robotics can do is further strengthen, reinforce, and speed up that whole process.
And so I guess to what extent would you say that the focus on large scale maneuver, which I think probably we still do. As a matter of fact, I was looking for the headline to see if I could find it here. This story about a month or so back to when the U.S. released some updated technical manuals about how, especially armored forces, were supposed to operate in this new drone environment based on the results there. And it was literally laughed at, not by the Russian army, but by the Ukrainian army. They said that this would never, ever work. But that implies that we're trying to take lessons in the current force and just slightly modify them to fit what we were doing before, as opposed to the wholesale paradigm change, which, if I hear you correctly, like the Russians have definitely gone away from these big battalion strike groups that they used at the start to now disjointed things with 3 and 5 man groups, mainly on the ground, and motorcycles and other things to avoid the drones. Have we changed properly, or do we need to do something different?
Well, this goes back to experimentation, and you have to protect the experimentation from this condition called presentism. In other words, there's always the predisposition of the professional soldier that has served for 25 or 30 years to look at something and say, how do I rig this outcome to ensure that nothing really puts the force I've lived in for so many years at risk? Do you understand what I'm saying? This is very important. In other words, we went through this during the interwar period, where the cavalry and the artillery worked tirelessly to prevent mechanization. They worked tirelessly to prevent armored forces from emerging. You had this mentality in the U.S. Army Air Corps about the bomber. They kept insisting, all we need are bombers. If we deliver enough bombs, we'll win the war and nobody else has to fight. And so we lost thousands of men and thousands of bombers ultimately because there were no fighter escorts. Ultimately, we finally broke down and said, yeah, we need fighter escorts, so the bombers are never going to get through. That was after we and the British lost 18,000 bombers. I mean, this sort of thing goes on. So what you're saying is a very important point. What has worked on the Ukrainian battlefield for the Russians? Is there a way to build in those lessons, those insights, so that we can make things work for us? I think the answer is yes. But we need to go out and experiment, and we need to be realistic. And that's why the Ukrainians laughed, because they're living literally in the middle of a target array. They are under constant bombardment from these massive numbers of strike systems. They are under persistent surveillance. So they're making the right comments. They're making the right points. I just don't know that we are open to it. But this is where the Secretary of War, as he calls himself now, steps in. And you set up not just a service pure experimentation, although some of that needs to happen at the lowest level, but you also need integration across service lines for what I call all arms, all effects warfare, so that you get a real picture of what the holistic outcome is. This takes time, a lot of time. This is not something you snap your fingers and create overnight, but it can be done. You know, the Germans started out with essentially trucks and what you would call the equivalent of a Jeep, running around with some tin welded to them, you know, light skin vehicles, radios stuck in them, a few machine guns. And since they had no heavy guns, they stuck tubes to, simulate tank guns. They started out in 1930. And by 1935, they had developed the new divisional structure, which had 2 full-strength battle groups in it that were mobile and armored. Those 2 battle groups were roughly 5,000 men each. And above that, you had some logistics, and then at the top, the command structure. Everybody looked at this and said, we think this is about right. And so Hitler made the decision to expand the numbers of divisions, and they went from 0 armor division to the one that was based on experimentation to instantly overnight, almost 10. When I say instantly, I'm talking over a few years.
Yeah.
This force goes into Poland. It wasn't perfect. They learned a lot of tough lessons. Contrary to popular belief, the Poles fought very effectively against the Germans. The Germans took losses. They sat down, they had a come to Jesus meeting and said, well, we got a lot right, but we also got some things wrong. So they changed things. So by the time you go into France, you've got a different force, different tactics, different operational thinking. And then finally, by the time you get to Russia, you've got a new army. I mean, my point is that you can make these changes, but the first part is this core of experimentation that has to be honest and open. And you have to be prepared to jettison what doesn't work anymore. Dump it. Forget it.
And that honesty, that intellectual honesty is what is, in my view, absolutely absent among the senior leaders. And I watched it in the future combat systems when we faked all of these experimentations that you're talking about in lieu of what we wanted the outcome to be, no matter what it actually was. And we paid the price for that. And now then in the last bit of time we have here, I'd like to, have you go over how you would see actually changing out, because if you don't get out the top change, like you said in there, if the guys who are responsible and benefit from the culture as it is are going to resist it, so you have to get a new one. Therefore, you have to replace a lot of these generals. So that's a hard deal. How would you effectively replace a new generation of leaders that could do this kind of experimentation?
Well, I think there are 2 ways. I mean, we'll look at that slide in a minute that gives you a snapshot of what the top looks like. But again, go back to George Marshall. And George Marshall had a man under his command, a major general named John K. Herr. John K. Herr was the chief of cavalry. And he famously told Marshall, this is after the German performance in Poland, after the Germans had overrun France and the Low Countries. He saw the value of mechanization and armored mobility and firepower. And John K. Herr told George Marshall, a tank runs out of fuel after a couple of days, but a horse takes several days to die. In other words, don't give up your horses yet. They'll outlast your tanks. Well, Herr was a distinguished soldier, highly decorated, fought throughout the First World War. Marshall, by the way, was never in combat during the First World War. He was a staff officer. But Herr had seen a lot of action. Silver Star. He may have had the DSC. Marshall had a lot of respect for him for his courage and professionalism, but that was the wrong answer. So Herr was marginalized and eventually retired. You've got to approach this with the same points in mind. But rather than go around and identify people on the basis of what you think their personal views are of policy, whether it's DEI or affirmative action or something else, you've got to get to a new structure. And if you put that slide up that shows how you go from 44 4-stars down to 10, this is how you do it. If you look to the left, there are all the structures and commands that justify 4 stars. For instance, until World War II, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army was always a 3-star. And that was true for the Navy as well. You only had one 4-star in the Army, and that was George Marshall. Well, we've got to go back to something like that. But I have gone actually further. I've tried to convert the chiefs of staff to commanders of U.S. ground forces, maritime forces, air, missile, and space defense forces. The other thing is that I know we've changed this word to war from Department of Defense, but I think we need to think very hard about defending ourselves because technology points to future vulnerabilities of us here in our home country. And then I've reduced the numbers of commands. So you now have Northern, Southern, Atlantic, and Pacific. I understand that they want to combine Northern and Southern Command, but that still leaves you with Central Command, European Command, Africa Command. Those all need to go away. And that's going to be a big fight because you have various lobbies that are going to insist that you have a Central Command. If you try to eliminate Central Command right now, the whole Israel lobby will go to war with you because Central Command is effectively Israel Command. U.S. European Command is the command that has been running the operations against the Russians in Ukraine. And so everybody will say, you can't do that. Well, you can do it all, and it all needs to be done. But it needs decisiveness and effective leadership and systematic planning, and also a recognition that we're probably going to see a 50% cut in defense coming. And then at the bottom, you end up with the Strategic Operations Command, Support Command, and Deterrence Command. Look on the left at all the different kinds of commands that you have. In other words, you're consolidating these functions in a way that is effective, but it's going to hurt people's feelings. I mean, people in Special Operations Command think they should be their own world, that they should be their own service. You know, the last thing we need are more services. I know Donald Trump got excited over Space Command, but we don't need another service. You can do what Space Command does, but you put it under the commander of U.S. Aerospace Forces and Space Forces and Air Force and everything else. Anyhow, this can all be done. It makes sense. It'll save us a lot of money. I think it'll make us a better fighting force. But we still need the change in the national military strategy that puts more emphasis on defense. Right now, we're built for offensive warfare everywhere. And that is a loser. It's a loser financially. It's not necessary.
And, you know, historically, Doug, I think that you just aren't going to get these kind of changes unless you are on the coals of a defeat and the wreckage that we've had, because I think you absolutely hit it on the head there. Every change you would propose making, there's a deeply entrenched in constituency that would fight tooth and nail against any of the changes, much less. And I think we need all of them to have an overall strategy. And I think the only way we get there, and please tell me I'm wrong, is if we get defeated somewhere in battle and now then we have the wreckage and everyone recognizes it's a failure. Otherwise, I don't know how we get to this better place.
Well, I think that's part of it, but it's also, there has to be a recognition that Vietnam was a strategic disaster. There needs to be a recognition that Afghanistan and Iraq were strategic disasters. If anyone thinks that Iraq is now a staunch ally of the United States as a result of our liberation, is insane. You know, the Afghans just told President Trump, for all intents and purposes, to stuff it over Bagram Air Base. Well, let's wake up and smell the coffee. We haven't had any successful military operations. And you'll find innumerable generals. Well, we won all the battles. How many times have I heard that? We won every major battle in Vietnam, yeah, and we lost the war. We have a serious problem with strategy and thinking. And unfortunately, because we've allowed these losses to go unpunished, all of these generals are drawing 6- and 7-figure salaries in retirement working for the defense industry, because ultimately, whether you win or lose, the defense industry is principally concerned with what? Making money. We have to realize that. Stop pretending that we have altruistic people in the defense industry. They are interested in making money. And if you are a guy that the administration likes and you're retired, they'll use you in order to get to more cash. That's all it's about. So you need a truthful, objective assessment of what's been going on for the past 50 years. And I don't see any good news, to be frank with you. I see nothing but disaster. But there's one other factor that has to be taken into account, and that is bankruptcy. We are closer now than perhaps we've ever been in our entire history to financial disaster. Gold is now the reserve currency, not the dollar. The world is de-dollarizing, and our monopoly of control over the institutions of financial power is just about gone because of an organization called BRICS. And all the military power that we mobilize is not going to change that. That's something we need to understand.
Well, we should understand it. I'm not sure that we do. I guess we'll have to wait and see how that folds out. But whatever the case is, one of the reasons we have this channel is because we are unintimidated, uncompromised to bring people the truth. And we need people. I want to make sure that everybody sees there is a blueprint out there, has been since 1997 with your first book. But we can have a much more powerful military that's actually defending us and is something that we can afford long term, if only we had the vision and the wisdom and the leadership to get it done. But it's out there, and you've done your best and you've done your part. Now we have to see if we can get the rest of our leadership to do the next steps. But we appreciate you pointing these things out, Doug. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Dan. Bye-bye.
And we appreciate you guys as well. Be sure and go to your podcast. I know a lot of your friends actually prefer to get their information on podcasts. Don't miss this chance to let them know so they don't miss stuff like this too. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, everywhere you get your podcast, type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive and you'll find us there. And of course, for those who prefer the written topic, we have that as well. DanielDavisDeepDive.substack.com. And you can find all those things there. You actually get a double shot there, both the videos and the written format. So be sure and share this around, folks. Don't keep it with you. I would like you to like and subscribe this video, and this channel is if you haven't already done that, that helps us too. But man, these things really help your friends. So share this with folks. Don't keep it to yourself. And we'll appreciate that a lot. And we will look forward to seeing you on the very next episode of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.